It's the worst violence between Israelis and Palestinians in years, a deadly flare-up between the Israeli army and the Palestinian militant group Hamas that is also taking a toll in mixed Arab-Jewish cities within Israel. After violent clashes at the Aqsa mosque in Jerusalem, the rocket fire from Gaza began, with Hamas targeting Tel Aviv and what it claims were military bases in southern and central Israel. Israel's military hit back with airstrikes on Hamas command centers, as well as Gaza's transport and medical systems. More than 220 Palestinians, including children, are dead, tens of thousands displaced, and at least 12 Israelis have lost their lives. Middle East crisis. What can stop the cycle of violence? Welcome to The Point. It's a pleasure to introduce our guests. Daniel Dillenburmer works for the German daily Die Welt, and he says the EU's failure as a credible peacemaker means that the best chance of mediation now lies in Israel's growing diplomatic ties with some Arab states. And great to have with us Akram Baker. He is a Palestinian American and a Middle East expert, and he says it's only by ending the Israeli occupation that a just and equitable solution can be achieved. And I'm very glad to introduce my DW colleague, Shani Rosanes, who reports for us on the Middle East and Israel. She says the political weakness on both sides' leadership has brought us to this unnecessary round, and it's only political change that can bring a long-term solution. So welcome to all of you. And let me start by getting your sense of how grave the situation is at the moment. Shani, you've been reporting for a long time on and from the region. The current violence came after an extended period of calm. Did it come as a surprise to you? And how would you say it compares with past conflicts between Israel and Palestinians?
Well, if you ask the Israeli military, they were completely surprised. If you hear, we were hearing their assessments at the beginning of the riots in Jerusalem. They were not expecting Hamas to act right now, definitely not so fiercely and for such a long time. So in a way, within Israeli community of intelligence, that was quite a big surprise. If you ask people on the ground, you could have seen this bubbling for a while. This whole started with Sheikh Jarrah. We've seen the Palestinians there that are...
a settlement in East Jerusalem.
Exactly. And the Palestinians living there, they're kind of in between. They're not really officially Israeli citizens, but they are not really also officially citizens of the Palestinian Authority. And they have been feeling what also many other Arab Israelis living within Israeli territories, feeling that they've been, they have the injustice when it comes to policy about housing and rights concerning land is just becoming too hard to bear. And so this has been bubbling and simmering very slowly. And that was also the month of Ramadan, which always makes everything hypersensitive. So in a way, there were many signs. It was a chance, whether people have read them or not, I think it's a lot about where you stand politically as well.
Akram, what are you hearing from family in the region? What are they telling you about the situation on the ground?
Well, on one side, it's absolutely horrible. I mean, I had a friend who was killed in Gaza last week, and his 8-year-old son. My sister's car got a bullet through the back of it, and she lives in Jerusalem. And it's absolutely terrible what has happened. And when you said something at the point of relative calm, the problem, it wasn't relative calm for the Palestinians. Israel continued to build the settlements and continued to oppress the Palestinians and create facts on the ground all of this time. It seems the world only wakes up when there's blood in the streets, which is one of the main problems. So, but what is great is that they also said Israel succeeded in uniting the Palestinian people from all over the world. That's something nobody has succeeded since Yasser Arafat in the 70s.
We'll talk about the extent of that in a moment, but let me go to you and ask you, we keep hearing that a ceasefire is around the corner, that the European peacemakers that you mentioned in your opening statement are upping the pressure on both sides. How long do you think this violence will continue? And do you think there's a possibility it could set off a wider conflagration in the region as a whole?
It doesn't seem to me at the moment that a wider conflagration is imminent. It's actually rather sensible to assume that the signs that a ceasefire is imminent now are actually true. Because we know that both sides in this conflict know that they can't really make substantial gains with military means. Both had internal reasons to act the way they did. To start with Hamas, they wanted to show their strength and send a signal of resolution in a Palestinian power crisis, which came after the Palestinian president postponed the elections again. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's fighting for his office, also has reasons to show himself a strong man. But both sides know that they can't change the situation substantially. So it's likely that we will see the violence end, and it's as likely that we will see the problem at the core of this violence persist.
Anybody disagree with that before I go on?
No, I mean, I think that most things he's right, but my one thing is that the violence is, unfortunately, this is just the latest outbreak of violence. But I absolutely agree with Daniel, is that the core reason that we have this violence will persist until we change that. You are right on that.
So I'd also want to be careful in trying to hint that this was a deliberate act of Netanyahu trying to get things out of hand. I think that would be too cynical of a blame. I think it must have been maybe a distraction. He was distracted due to the political place where he's at, and I think he may have realized once this is happening, then he cannot stop it, that he might be able to leverage it. But I'd be very careful with hinting that he deliberately planned that.
You're already deep into causes. Can I just stop us for one moment, because I do want to take a closer look at the causes, but I'd like to bring in a short film that we have, and I'd like to get Shani, first of all, if you would, and it's a very tough question, to give us a brief summary of what you see as the complex chain of immediate events that led to this current outbreak.
So we've seen, first of all, we need to keep in mind, we will be talking a lot about leadership, but what's happening on the ground is what we see online in social media, in TikTok, for example. There was, and that was quite a big thing. There was an Arab youth in Jerusalem that was slapping an Orthodox man on the train, and that became super viral on TikTok. And then in response, some youth in Israel decided they need to respond to that. And so things have kind of slowly gotten out of hand, because what we're seeing on the level of the ground, both within the Palestinians and the Israelis, it's a lot of youth going out there being very much moved to emotion and to action on some of these key issues like Jerusalem, which is a very emotional key topic. So that has been happening. And then, in a way, the leadership has sort of kind of rode that wave, or had to, if it comes to Hamas or in Israel, had to respond to that. And then I think the most detrimental act was when police forces stormed the Aqsa mosque during Ramadan on the 10th of May. And that ended up, with Hamas feeling they need to respond, being the protectors of Jerusalem, firing rockets at Israel after setting an ultimatum that they knew would not be accepted. And that was the beginning of a downward spiral that just quickly got out of hand.
So let's drill a little deeper and start with Jerusalem, which, of course, has long been a powder keg. The city is holy to both Muslims and Jews. Access to religious sites and unresolved disputes over territory have sparked conflicts that go back decades. Recent tensions over an Israeli settlement in East Jerusalem, Shani mentioned it earlier, Sheikh Jarrah, helped set off the current conflagration.
In the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, Muna El-Kurd and 3 other Palestinian families are faced with being expelled from their homes. This land belongs to us. We lived here legally, and everything is documented legally. They come here and occupy the place, and they want to occupy what remains of the neighborhood. Jewish settlers claim they're entitled to parts of this neighborhood and have taken the disputes to court.
It belonged to Jews for almost 100 years. Jews lived there, and Jews own the land since then. Nothing changed, besides one thing, that the Arabs suddenly decided that they are the owners of the land, of the property.
Now, Palestinians are faced with yet another threat of expulsion. Are Israel's settlements the source of the ongoing conflict?
Akram, since Israel was founded in 1948, wars and Israeli settlement construction have displaced some 5 million Palestinians, according to UN estimates. The UN Commission for Human Rights has called the forced removal of Palestinian families a potential war crime. Israeli officials say it is a real estate dispute between private parties. How do you see it?
Well, what the Israelis say is just insulting. It's a real estate dispute. Of course, it's not a real estate dispute. Israeli settlements are a byproduct of the Israeli occupation, the longest military occupation in history. 54 years, and we're going on and on and on. And that is the problem that we have to solve. And we in the West are enabling that, and we have enabled that, and that's what has to change.
Shani, as a young law student in the 80s, I wrote my first law review note on the status of Jerusalem. Already then, both sides claiming it, of course, as their capital, Israel declaring it would annex it. Are we any closer to seeing this dispute resolved than we were back then?
I'm afraid not. I'm sure your paper is still intact and still valid till today as well. This is not going to be resolved before there is real negotiations that make it to the core issues that divide Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, and this is nothing that we're seeing coming anytime soon in the current configuration of political forces. I mean, not only in Israel, where we've seen the deepest, hardest political crisis for the last 2 years with 4 election campaigns, but also within the Palestinian side. We keep talking about Palestinians, and we need to remember there's a division. There's a very big, deep rift between what happens in Gaza, led by Hamas, and what we're seeing as the official, internationally recognized government of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And as long as there's not inner Palestinian dialogue and some inner Israeli solutions to their political problems, we're never going to move forward with solving the problems between the sides and getting legitimacy for a real negotiation that really deals with the core issues.
Daniel, President Trump took the step of moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a clear gesture of support to Netanyahu. Would you say that that changed the situation on the ground? And, I asked Shani at the very beginning whether the violence came as a surprise. The fact is, there was no uprising at that time. Some people found that surprising.
Well, it might seem surprising now when we see what causes the violence at the moment, that the causes of the current violence are far more ephemeral than this step of the United States, which seemed momentous at that time. If we look back at that, I would say it definitely helped alienating the Palestinians further from the United States government at that time, and it might make it harder for the Biden administration to reapproach the Palestinians. On the other hand, we don't see a Biden administration that is too eager to approach the problem at all. It seems that they are actually hoping to get rid of this problem as quickly as possible. So I think in the end it didn't make much of a sense, but it's clear that part of the problem at hand here lies in Washington, that is not willing to act.
And I want to come back to the role of outside mediators in just a moment, but we heard from Akram a moment ago that the current violence has united Palestinians. As we know, there have been deep, deep divisions between Hamas and Fatah. Would you say that's true, that there is a much more united Palestinian sense right now than before?
Far from it. Far from it. I disagree with Akram in this respect very strongly. What we see now are shows of unity, but these shows actually just try to hide away a division that becomes ever deeper and that has become deeper for internal reasons. The division has become deeper mainly because the current elected Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian National Authority, which has been elected 15 years ago and didn't have a re-election since then, again postponed the elections in the Palestinian territories.
May I respond to that?
Oh, please.
You know, Daniel, unfortunately, that shows your lack of understanding of the Palestinian people, because the divisions have been externally and artificially implemented on the Palestinian people due to all of the horrible circumstances that they have lived under. The truth is that Palestinians themselves, they have been divided in between Palestinians in Israel, West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, refugees, and all the time. And now you see the true Palestinians, that they are one. The fact is that the Palestinian Authority is an illegitimate, corrupt thing. You keep saying they're legitimate representatives. They are not. Neither is Hamas. Actually, the Palestinian Authority was there is only one legitimate representative, which I see, and it's the only way forward, and that is a reformed and reconstituted PLO, Palestine.
But I think the problem is that the Palestinians are only able to show unity or make believe they are united when they are being attacked. They are not unified enough to act independently towards a solution of the problem. When it comes to that, they're deeply divided, and that's at the core of the problem
here.
When
you put cats in a cage and you keep reducing the amount of food that they have, they're going to fight. But when someone comes in and attacks them, all of a sudden they were able to defend themselves.
But the Palestinians are not only helpless victims. They can decide upon their destiny. Don't portray them.
Let me bring in Shani here. She's been trying to get...
There's several things we need to keep in mind. First of all, even within Hamas, we have great division. Hamas's leadership is not sitting in Gaza. They are not the one getting, to live under what is considered by many as the world's biggest open air prison. It's
14-year lockdown.
Exactly. It's hard conditions, and the leadership is not there for all sorts of maybe legitimate reasons, but that is the fact. And what we've seen is the corruption. We've seen what's happening on both levels, in Hamas and in Fatah. You have those who are leading, and then you have those on the ground. And the great despair in conditions that between those two groups is unimaginable. And I think this is what Akram is trying to say. Is maybe the voice of the people is such that they're fed up with leadership, and you see the mistrust in leadership, unequivocally. But I also want to come back to the question of the Jerusalem embassy. What we've seen it doing is mostly sending a signal that it weakens the West Bank PLO Fatah leadership. So basically, instead of giving any rope or any suggestions of support to the more moderate side of the Palestinians, it's been a slap in their face. And what we're seeing as a result of that the extreme voices, those who do bother to defend Jerusalem as they see themselves now, Hamas, are gaining leverage and actually winning, because Jerusalem was left with no one to defend it once the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank has become so weakened, partially also due to American actions.
Let me make a brief cut there, if I may, because our clock has not a lot of time left on it. And I would also like to talk about the other side, because your opening statement talked about weak leadership on both sides. And I'm hearing from all of you a concession that there is some weak leadership on the Palestinian side. So let's talk about the Israeli one. As you mentioned, the government was struggling already to preserve its power when this crisis broke. Your opening statement talked about weak leadership there as well. How does that play a role here?
Well, first of all, let's again talk about the level of the people. There's a lot of mistrust. You see it online, you see it amongst people. They don't know.
Within Israel,
within Israelis, even those who are not necessarily too far to the left. Israelis are not dumb. They remember we've been in these rounds of escalation time and again. And we're talking now about ceasefire, and nobody's even discussing what the conditions are, because there are no real demands. this was sort of a charade. This was a show of both sides, both, leaderships on both sides who had a lot to gain by showing dominance, by playing the card of deterrence and so on. But the people, they understand that the gain at the bottom line is for them personally is very small. Netanyahu has been struggling in the last 2 years to hold to power. And he was under imminent threat for his leadership right before this broke out. I mean, for the first time, we saw a real chance of another government, not only just a different government without Netanyahu, but a government who would also breach, into over the aisle to the Arab-Israeli community and bring it in, which is a fundamental change and also a threat in a way to those on the right who do not want to see this alliance, who do not want to see this coming together. They benefit from what we're seeing now, these clashes that just make the rift deeper, and put a mark on what divides Israel as a very complex mixed society instead of what unites that society. And within these conditions, that operation is definitely making everything far more complicated and intense.
And another thing that makes the situation quite a bit more complicated is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now facing an unprecedented problem within Israel, namely clashes between Jewish and Arab residents in Israel. In the past week, cities all over the country have been engulfed in unrest with reports of attacks on Arab peoples and on synagogues. Israeli politicians have voiced concerns that the situation could, in fact, spiral into civil war. Daniel, shouldn't that actually add impetus to Israel's willingness to agree to a ceasefire? And how would you describe the two sides' objectives? What goals would have to be met for them to both climb down?
Well, to your first question, how that influences the politics in Israel, I think that depends on the political perspective you take. Because part of the Israeli political landscape, the conservative part, the right-wing part, has actually at least taken steps in the last years that were sure to deepen the divide between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, namely the statehood law, which the Netanyahu government put in place not too long ago, took the status of official language from Arabic, and that helped even back then to deepen the divide between Jewish and Arab Israelis. So it seems that part of the political elite in Israel actually uses this polarization, at least for their electoral tactics, notwithstanding the fact that the very same camp is trying to form coalitions with Arab parties at the moment. But of course, finding a solution for Israelis and Palestinians would help to mitigate these tensions, because obviously they're also connected to shared sufferings between Arab Israelis and their Palestinian brethren.
Can I just... I disagree. I really find the problem of calling them Arab Israelis. This is a term that the state of Israel gives them. These are Palestinian citizens of Israel. And they are second-class citizens at that. Because
they themselves call themselves in a different way. Some of them do.
They like to call themselves Palestinian citizens
of Israel. That varies a lot, and I don't think you can decide
I think I'm closer to them than you are, Daniel. But the point is that they are second-class citizens, have always been that. That has been the core of the problem. And when you see that, this is why I'm saying, is that this is not a group of 100 million Arabs we're talking about. We're talking about Palestinians who live in the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River.
Akram, I'm going to stop you there. We have literally just 2 minutes left on the clock. But I do want to talk about one central element, namely two-state solution. An independent Palestinian state within a state model remains the formal vision for a negotiated compromise. And you yourself say there has to be a just and equitable solution to stop the violence. Some commentators have called the current violence the death of the two-state solution. Very quickly, would you agree that it is no longer feasible?
I believe that the two-state solution was killed off by Israel 15 years ago, and I've been saying so publicly ever since. The one solution is to have one state, which is for all of its citizens, regardless of race or religion, where you have duties and responsibilities. That's what I believe in. And I believe that's the only way.
Shani, react to that, please.
I don't see Israel. Yeah, I don't see Israelis go for it after we've seen the clashes also within Israeli mixed cities of Arabs and Jews living together. We've seen them going in flames. I think any solution that brings them all together into one state, that's not going to happen. It's not feasible after what we've seen.
I want to bring in settlements have taken up all the land.
Let me bring in Daniel on this. We're not going to solve the problem for sure in the last minute in our show, but Daniel, who amongst the outside mediators really would have any chance to push us toward some form of negotiations? You say not Europe. What about the U.S. and those Arab states you mentioned in your opening statement?
It will never work without the U.S., but I think a chance for reuniting the Palestinians and give them incentives for making an agreement with Israel lies really with the new Arab allies Israel has been finding in the Arab world and is still searching.
What would you want to see the U.S. do? Within his own party, Joe Biden's facing a lot of criticism.
Well, the United States will have to find a way to exert pressure on Israel to give Israel an incentive for a new solution without alienating their power bases in the United States, which is partly Jewish.
But we have to keep in mind Hamas Hamas and the Arab countries, the moderate Arab countries, they're not going to come together. As long as Hamas is not integrated into leadership, that's a problem.
I'm going to have to stop our show right here. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to all of you for joining in.